28 miles off the northern coast of Taiwan, the commercial pipelayer ship, the Haijing, or Sea Mirror, sat idle, its maneuvering thrusters keeping the ship's location fixed against the rough rolling waters of the East China Sea. At a cursory look, the Haijing would appear to be a corporate-owned and operated vessel. A deeper look, however, would reveal that, like the hundreds of other ships operating in the region, the Haijing was part of the Chinese maritime militia, a shadowy, obscure fleet controlled by the Chinese military tasked with monitoring, and in many cases, violently harassing both China's rivals and regional neighbors. On August 11, 2032, the Haijing was on an assignment, but its purpose was neither commercial nor innocent. Below the vessel and released hours earlier were 3 unmanned underwater vehicles, or UUVs, each gliding just feet above the seabed. From a cabin aboard the ship, operators monitored the vehicles as they made their way to their designated targets, each located and surveilled months before. Once in position and latched to their targets, and with the Haijing making 8 knots for the port of Fuzhou, the UUVs detonated. In a fraction of a second, at a network management operations center in Oregon, alerts began flashing. As engineers analyzed the log reports, the cause of the break to their multi-billion-dollar, 8,000-mile cable, providing one of the highest-speed undersea fiber optic networks on the planet, was unknown. What was known with some certainty was that it had occurred at a location just north of Taiwan. Moments later, the engineers learned that they were not alone in their pain. Across the Pacific, scores of other alerts inside other companies, on other cables, were flashing, with their own connections severed or disrupted. "Put this day down in the record books," said network engineer Ernest Magdaleno. "This is what a global-scale cyber attack looks like." Magdaleno would come to refine that assessment much later, admitting, "I woefully underestimated. What we witnessed was a digital Pearl Harbor, and that was only the start." While digital chaos reigned across the Pacific, 10 miles south of the city of Nanjing, China, General Li Bosheng, commander of the PLA's Eastern Theater Command, strolled his ritual daily path around the park-like grounds near the Joint Operations Command Center. For the general, it was a brief moment of quiet between the storms. Moments before, he'd received the latest update to the massive cyber attack carried out under his command. It was resoundingly good news. Of the 15 undersea fiber optic cables providing over 90% of Taiwan's internet, all were either physically severed by explosives or cutting anchors, or were being disrupted or significantly slowed through the PLA's seizing of administrative rights to network management software hacked months or sometimes years earlier. Above the planet, the small number of regionally operated low Earth orbit satellites carrying internet to Taiwan were also under attack. Not kinetically, but through a coordinated denial of service attack that overwhelmed the network's capacity. As the general's aide summarized it, the fire hose of data that had connected Taiwan to the world was now a coffee straw, at best. The results felt in Taiwan were immediate, where industries from semiconductor production to healthcare, travel, manufacturing and media all ground to a halt. Globally, markets plummeted, with brittle supply chain networks thrown into uncertainty in an already anxious world. With a significant share of the world's semiconductors originating in Taiwan, the near-future supply and sale of everything from cars to phones to the latest toys in demand for the holidays were all in doubt. Talking heads in the Western financial media were predicting the fallout, calling it COVID on steroids. Back in the JOCC, General Bosheng was pleased with the reports coming in. nicknamed Miao Si, or the Muse, for his close advisorship with Premier Liu Hao and for his architecting of the overall Taiwan operation. Busheng pinned his hopes that the quarantine and isolation of Taiwan would deliver Liu Hao the tools he needed to pressure Taiwan into capitulation, and which, in its finality, would redress what China called a century of humiliation by restoring its hegemonic position in the Indo-Pacific. Yet Busheng's pleasure in the events of the day also masked a deep unease, that if the isolation effort failed, Liu Hao would surely order him to carry out the next stage of his blueprint, the invasion of Taiwan. When the general had delivered his plan to the premier, he had also brought a warning that the time was late, that the Taiwanese, Americans and their allies had strengthened their military positions in the region, and that a fight, if it came to it, would be costly, even with the Americans fighting the Russians in Europe. Left unsaid was his unease that with the PLA entirely untested in battle, and exotic, high-cost weaponry unproven, and in some cases oversold to the powers that be in the Chinese Communist Party, the general believed the outcome was anything but certain. But inside Liu Hao's shrinking bubble of advisors, each telling him what he wanted versus needing to hear, the premier was confident and certain in his endeavor, that after decades of preparation and trillions spent, victory would come quickly. And though the cost would be harsh militarily, economically and politically, the world would have no choice but to move on, under new rules. For General Busheng, the question now was how Taiwan and the US would respond to the day's events. If their apprehension of escalation stayed their hand, or whatever actions they carried out proved merely symbolic, either would be a victory for Busheng, who was confident that as long as the conflict simmered without going to boil, time and odds would favor China. He didn't have to wait long for an answer. Near the Babuyan Islands, northeast of Luzon, the Ohio-class guided missile submarine, the USS Michigan, lay hidden, silent, and deep. Aboard the boat, Captain Mark Tomlinson and Executive Officer Richard Henry reviewed the latest intelligence gathered from their network of AUVs released by the USS Michigan days earlier. It revealed that the covert and unacknowledged grey war in the waters of Taiwan was raging, with Chinese, Taiwanese, US, and allied UUVs and AUVs engaged in numerous slow-motion undersea skirmishes in response to China's attacks, resulting in vehicle losses on all sides. As the USS Michigan identified targets and coordinated attacks for other units in the region, Captain Tomlinson's most pressing worry was that the drone battle could escalate, whether deliberately or accidentally, into a full-on war. Hours later, his worries of escalation were confirmed with reports that a Taiwanese Hai-Lung-class submarine, the Sea Tiger, falsely believing itself to be under attack within the confusion and clutter of nearby drone battles, had fired a torpedo, striking and crippling a Chinese Coast Guard ship, killing an unknown number of crew. Hearing the news aboard the USS Michigan, Captain Tomlinson stated darkly, "So much for the so-called Grey War." Back in Nanjing, General Busheng received updates about the undersea drone battles, as well as news that the Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia was under a major counter-cyber attack against its maritime logistics control system, which was slowing and frustrating operations both in port and at sea. The general considered the cyber attack annoying and troublesome, as were the drone battles, but it was all neither surprising nor escalatory. But then came news of the attack on the Jiangdao-class corvette that was reportedly listing and likely to sink. Suspecting a torpedo from either a US or Taiwanese sub, with both known to be operating in the region at the time, the attack was seen as a significant escalation. Soon after, General Busheng received new orders. Premier Hao was demanding a counter, in sight and in kind. It would come soon after in the East China Sea, with the sudden explosion and sinking of the US-flagged container ship, the Iron Meridian, 250 miles west off Okinawa. The cause of the explosion that killed 2 and injured 4 crew members was unknown to the Americans, but all intelligence pointed to an underwater smart mine, likely deployed from a low-flying Chinese H-6 bomber, operating in the area at the time. Premier Howe's implicit message to the US was clear. He was more than willing to ratchet up the pressure, and that by striking far beyond the quarantine's borders, cargo insurers worldwide would now be forced to re-evaluate their coverage for those ships operating throughout the entire region. The long-term cost of this, later described by an economic analyst, is beyond my imagination. In Washington, D.C., under a steady flood of news coverage of the potential economic fallout and footage of the burning Iron Meridian, President Dalman and the Security Council were under increasing pressure to act. Equally worrying for the administration were reports from inside the State Department that the Philippine government, already wary of US commitment in the region, was considering taking a neutral stance if the situation continued without US action. Losing the Philippines for the basing of aircraft and supplies in the event of war would be, as Pentagon analysts put it, catastrophic. In response, Dalman and the Security Council convened and came to a contentious decision. They assessed that China's attacks thus far, limited solely to drones, civilian and Taiwanese targets, indicated an unwillingness to escalate by striking US military forces directly. With that confidence in hand, the decision was made that the US Navy would conduct escort missions of civilian shipping into Taiwan to ultimately test, stress, and break the quarantine. It worked in the Berlin airlift without getting us into a war, said Secretary of Defense Bruce Lager. It can work again. Later in the Philippine Sea, 500 miles southeast of Taiwan, Rear Admiral Richard Ward, commander of US Navy Carrier Strike Group 5, aboard the USS George Washington, received his new orders. As he looked out over the clearing skies, he reflected on what would be a consequential mission. He would later write in his journal, "This time we're the Soviets heading for Cuba in '62. Only this time we're going all the way. And I don't think either side fully appreciates where that might lead." And while the powers in Beijing and Washington carried on, Rear Admiral Ward and elements of Carrier Strike Group 5 were about to play a very dangerous and deadly game of chicken. Coming up in the next episode, the US and its allies face the gauntlet and a showdown in the waters off Taiwan. If you enjoy this series, please send a YouTube thanks or join the Flat Circle History Patreon site, where you'll get behind-the-scenes access, commercial-free episodes, and tons of member-only content. Plus, it will help out John, the guy who makes this series possible. Also, a quick shout-out to Michael Hilliard of the Redline podcast, Darth Rust, David Wellington, Fix Edit, and a few others, some that shall remain anonymous, for your subject matter expertise and review about the plausibility of this episode. Thanks to you all. And as always, please like, subscribe, and share this video. And thanks for watching.